In this video, we're going to do one of the practice warm-up problems on javabat.com. Javabat is a great website for working on your Java skills. It lets you write programs using a web browser, and you can immediately see whether or not the answer that you write, whether or not the code that you write is correct or not. It uses a bunch of different tests to see if the code you're putting in is correct, and it immediately shows it to you. So it's really good for getting immediate feedback on how you're doing. So we're going to start with the very first problem on the website, this one called sleepIn. So this is a pretty easy problem to start with. As it says, the parameter weekday is true if it is a weekday, and the parameter vacation is true if we are on vacation. We sleep in if it is not a weekday or we're on vacation. Return true if we should sleep in. So Javabat has already given us a method. They've got it defined right here that we just have to implement. And it sounds like it's going to be pretty easy to implement. They've even given us some clues right up here. So let me talk a little bit about this method to start off with. This is a method that has two parameters. One's called weekday and the other's called vacation. And they're both Boolean. And a Boolean can either be true or it can be false. Those are the only two values it can have. So we've got two Booleans being passed into the function, and then we have to return a Boolean as well. So this function, this method, has to make a decision given whether or not it's a weekday and whether or not you're on vacation, and then return true or false for whether you should sleep in or not. So we're going to have an if statement, I believe. So we're going to have if something, tab doesn't work in the web browser, as you can see, return true, else return false. Okay, so this is not valid code yet because this if statement right here, that's not going to work. But let's go ahead and run this bad code just to see what happens. So go. Yep, and it tells us there's a compile problem. That means that something about the Java wasn't formed correctly. Either we made an error typing it in, or we just, got something wrong. Now, you see this term syntax error a lot when you're first starting to program because you don't know the syntax, the correct way to do Java yet, and so you just make a lot of mistakes. So let's clear that off and try and fix this code. So we have to put a statement into this if that's going to evaluate to true or false. So our first stab at it could be pretty simple. We could just say if vacation, and that's exactly the same thing as saying if vacation is equal to true. Those are equivalent. So we can just say if vacation, return true, else return false. And we can try and run this. Okay, and this time it compiles correctly, and it's able to run, but Javabat, being such a great website, has these wonderful little things, which are tests that it runs on your method. So it actually has gone through and checked all the possible combinations of being told false, false, true, false, true, and true, true, and it knows what values you're supposed to get back. So we got back the correct thing 3 of the times, but the wrong thing when weekday is false. Now that makes sense that we would get the wrong thing when weekday is false, because we're just ignoring that parameter completely. So we're going to have to check weekday somehow. So it's going to have to go in the if statement as well. So we could say if weekday or, okay, now just to make sure you're clear, this thing right here means or, okay? You just mentally say, you know, or when you see that. It's equivalent to this, except if you actually type that in, you would get a syntax error. But those two little pipes mean or. And what or means is, let's see if I can do this. So if you have true or true, that's going to be true. If you have true or false, well, one of those is true, so that's going to be true too. If you have false or true, well, that's going to be true too because one of them is true. The only time you're going to get a false as a result of an or is if it's both falses. So false or false, that's going to be false. So that's sort of an important little table to remember, and you can figure that out. I mean, it makes sense. Let's clear that off and look back at this weekday thing. So does this make sense? Right now we're saying if weekday or vacation return true. But that's not right, because what we would love to say is if weekend or vacation return true. But we don't have a variable named weekend. All we have is weekday. But what we can do is do not weekday. It's either going to be the weekend or a weekday. And by doing this, putting this exclamation point right here, we flip weekday from true to false. So drawing that little table I had, if you do not true, that's going to equal false. And if you do not false, that's going to equal true. So let's see what happens now. Okay, we got it right. Everything worked out perfectly that time. So let me do one last walkthrough of this to make sure you get it. This is a method that Javabat gave us called sleepIn. It's being told whether or not it's a weekday. A Boolean is true or false, so that's whether or not, and whether or not you're on vacation. What we're saying in this code we've written is if it's not a weekday or we're on vacation, which you can mentally change to if weekend or vacation, return true, otherwise return false. So we'll always be returning a value, because if this is false, if this whole thing evaluates to false, we'll just return right here. If this evaluates to true, we return true. So one last little pattern. Whenever you see something like this, where you do if something or if something return true, else return false, you can actually simplify all that to return not weekend or vacation. So let's comment this stuff out so it won't get run. And go. Oh, that's a syntax error. No variable named that. So we go, and that works again. So these two forms are basically equivalent. This if statement, or this stuff inside of the if statement, turns into a Boolean, and we can just return that rather than having this if-else. That's all for today, so check out my next video and we'll go through some more Javabat problems.